Caesar was a writer, or he wrote multiple different things, and was a great orator, among the best of his time. So a literary man, really, just another feather to his bow. He's something like a polymath, really, what in later times you might call a polymath, a Renaissance man. He could turn his hand to anything, really, and would be probably quite good at it. You know, he's a great politician, a great general, great strategist and tactician, great orator. A very personable, likeable person, if he wanted to be. Great at parties. Okay, so that with no further ado, let's jump straight into the text. And so book one, we get told all about the Helvetii. They're sort of first up on Caesar's menu of Celtic, Gaulish, French tribes that he's going to defeat. And remember, just before I start, this is the words of Julius Caesar himself, the divine Julius. This is a man, one of the greatest figures in all of history, speaking to us over a chasm of over 2,000 years. I always think it's a remarkable thing to remember that whenever you're reading any sort of ancient text. But this is particularly remarkable because it's Caesar himself. So he starts by giving us just an idea of the geography and the people and what's going on, the context he finds when he first takes up his command in Gaul. So, Caesar tells us, quote, Gaul comprises 3 areas inhabited respectively by the Belgae, the Aquitani, and a people who call themselves Celts, though we call them Gauls. All of these have different languages, customs, and laws. The Celts are separated from the Aquitani by the river Garonne, from the Belgae by the Marne and the Seine. Again, I'll put pictures on maps up so people can see exactly what he's talking about. The Belgae are the bravest of the 3 peoples, being furthest removed from the highly developed civilizations of the Roman province, least often visited by merchants with enervating luxuries for sale, and nearest to the Germans across the Rhine, with whom they are constantly at war. For the same reason, the Helvetii are braver than the rest of the Celts. They are in almost daily conflict with the Germans, either trying to keep them out of Switzerland or themselves invading Germany. The region occupied by the Celts, which has one frontier facing north, is bounded by the Rhone, the Garonne, the Atlantic Ocean, and the country of the Belgae. The part of it inhabited by the Sequani and the Helvetii also touches the Rhine. The Belgic territory, facing north and east, runs from the northern frontier of the Celts to the lower Rhine. Aquitania is bounded by the Garonne, the Pyrenees, and the part of the Atlantic coast nearest Spain. It faces northwest. The foremost man among the Helvetii in rank and wealth was Orgetorix. In the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Piso, which was 61 BC, he was induced by the hope of obtaining royal power to organise a conspiracy of noblemen and persuaded his countrymen to emigrate en masse, telling them that they were the best fighters in Gaul and they could very easily conquer the whole country. They listened the more readily to his proposal because their territory is completely hemmed in by natural barriers. On one side by the Rhine, a very broad and deep river, which is the frontier between them and the Germans. On another side by the high mountain range of the Jura. Between them and the Sequani, on a third, by the Lake of Geneva and the Rhone, which form the boundary between the Helvetii and the Roman province. These obstacles restricted their movement and made it more difficult to attack their neighbours. And as they are a warlike people, they greatly resented this restraint. Considering their large population, military prestige, and reputation for bravery, they felt that their territory, only 220 miles long, 165 wide, was unduly small. Impelled by this feeling and by the influence of Orgetorix, they determined to prepare for emigration by buying up all the draft cattle and wagons they could, sowing as much land as possible in order to secure an adequate supply of corn for the journey, and establishing peaceful and friendly relations with their neighbours. They thought that 2 years would suffice for completing these preparations, and passed a formal resolution fixing their departure for the 3rd year. Orgetorix was put in charge of the arrangements and undertook a mission to the neighbouring peoples, in the course of which he persuaded a Sequanian named Casticus, whose father had been king of his tribe for many years and had been honoured by the Senate with the title of Friend of the Roman People, to seize the royal power which his father had held before him. He also induced the Aeduan Dumnorix, who at that time held the chief magistracy of his tribe and enjoyed great popularity, to make a similar attempt and gave him his daughter in marriage. Orgetorix convinced them that these schemes were quite easy to achieve by telling them that he intended to usurp the sovereignty of his own state, which he said was beyond question the most powerful in Gaul, and that he would use his wealth and military strength to secure them the possession of their thrones. His argument proved effective. The three men swore an oath of mutual loyalty, hoping that once they had made themselves kings, the great power of the warlike peoples they ruled would enable them to get control of all Gaul. The intrigue was revealed to the Helvetii by informers, and in accordance with the national custom, Augetrix was summoned to stand his trial in chains. Since condemnation would mean death at the stake, he collected all his slaves, numbering some 10,000, from his various estates, and brought them to the place of trial on the day appointed for the hearing, together with all his numerous retainers and debtor bondsmen, sort of men-at-arms, I suppose you might say. By means of their protection, he escaped trial. Intimidation, no doubt. His countrymen were angered by this behaviour and attempted to assert their rights by armed force. But while the magistrates were calling up a large body of men from the countryside, Augetrix died, perhaps, as the Helvetii believe, by his own hand. The Helvetii, however, did not relax their efforts to carry out their intended migration. As soon as they considered themselves ready, they burnt all their 12 towns and 400 villages, as well as the isolated buildings belonging to private individuals, and also the whole of their grain, except what they intended to carry with them, for they brought that. If there was no possibility of returning home, they would be more willing to face all the perils that awaited them. Every man was directed to take with him from home 3 months' supply of flour for his own use. They persuaded their neighbours, the Rurasi, Talingi, and Latovici, to follow their example, to burn their towns and villages and go with them, and were joined also by the Boii, who formerly lived on the other side of the Rhine, but had recently emigrated into Austria and attacked the town of Noria. There were only 2 routes by which the Helvetii could leave their country. One led between the Jura Mountains and the Rhone, through the land of the Sequani, and was so narrow and difficult that wagons could scarcely pass along it in single file, and a higher mountain overhung it, so that a mere handful of men could easily make it impassable. The other route, leading through the Roman province, was much easier and more convenient. For the Rhone, which forms the frontier between the Helvetii and the Allobroges, who had recently, in 61 BC, been subdued by Rome, is fordable at several places, the Rhone River. The frontier town of the Allobroges, nearest to Switzerland, and connected it with a bridge, is Geneva. The Helvetii thought that they could either induce the Allobroges to let them pass through, as they were believed to be still unfriendly towards the Romans, or compel them by force to do so. When everything was ready for their departure, they fixed a day for a general muster on the bank of the Rhone, the 28th of March, in the consulship of Lucius Piso and Ullius Gabinius, which is 58 BC. When Caesar was informed, again Caesar always refers to himself in the third person, when Caesar was informed that they were attempting to pass through the province, he left Rome at once and travelled post-haste to the neighbourhood of Geneva, as there was only 1 legion stationed in Gaul. He ordered as many fresh troops as possible to be raised throughout the province, and had the bridge of Geneva destroyed. On hearing of his arrival, the Helvetii sent an embassy, composed of their most illustrious citizens, to say that they intended to march through the province because there was no other route open to them. They promised to do no harm and asked for his consent. As Caesar remembered that the consul Lucius Cassius had been killed by the Helvetii, and his army routed and sent under the yoke, that was in 107 BC, so quite a while ago now, really, he was not disposed to grant their request. If people so hostile to Rome were permitted to go through the province, he did not think they were likely to refrain from damage to persons and property. However, to gain time for the assembly of the troops he had ordered to be levied, he told the envoys that he would consider the matter at leisure. If they wished to present their request again, they were to return on the 13th of April. In the meantime, he employed the legion he had with him and the troops that had been raised in the province to fortify the bank of the Rhone for a distance of 18 miles between the Lake of Geneva and the Jura, the frontier between the Helvetii and the Sequani. This was effected by means of a rampart 16 feet high with a trench running parallel. So think of that, that's no mean feat. An 18-mile-long line of rampart that's 16 feet high and with a trench. He then placed redoubts at intervals along the fortification and garrisoned them with pickets. so that he could stop the Helvetii more easily should they attempt to force a passage. When on the appointed day the envoys returned, he told them that it would be contrary to precedent and the traditions of the Roman state to allow anyone to march through the province, and that if they tried to use force he would stop them. Disappointed of this hope, some of the Helvetii endeavoured, generally, though not always, by night, to get across by lashing boats together and making a number of rafts, others by wading through the shallowest places of the River Rhone, again, he's talking about there. But the Roman troops always hastened up to the danger points and, aided by the fortifications, drove them back with volleys of missiles and forced them to abandon their attempts. There remained only the route through the land of the Sequani, which was so narrow that it could not be used without their consent. Being unable to obtain permission by their own efforts, the Helvetii sent an embassy to Dumnorix, the Aeduan, hoping by his intercession to gain what they desired. Dumnorix's popularity and open-handedness had won him great influence among the Sequani, and he was well disposed towards the Helvetii because he had married a woman of their country, a daughter of Orgetorix. His ambition for kingly power made him favour political change, and he wanted to lay as many tribes as possible under obligations to himself. Accordingly, he undertook the commission, induced the Sequani to let the Helvetii go through, and arranged an exchange of hostages between them. The Helvetii undertook to pass through without harming anyone or doing any damage, the Sequani to let them travel without interference. Caesar was informed that the Helvetii intended to cross the territories of the Sequani and the Aedui, and to enter the country of the Santoni, which is not far from that of the Tolosates, a tribe living in the Roman province. He saw that it would be very dangerous to the province to have a warlike people, hostile to Rome, established close to its rich cornlands, which were without any natural defences. Accordingly, leaving Titus Labienus, one of his generals, in charge of the fortifications he had constructed, he marched at top speed into northern Italy, enrolled 2 new legions there, sent for the 3 which were in winter quarters near Aquileia, and hastened back with all 5 by the shortest route over the Alps into Gaul. See, this is classic Caesar 101, doing everything super quickly, not expecting to turn up somewhere with like 5 legions. This classic Caesar. An attempt was made to hinder his march by the Suetrones, Graeliocelli and Catoges. You've just got to get used to loads of names of tribes. There's no way around it. That's just going to keep happening. Who seized some commanding heights. Beating them off in several engagements, Caesar marched in 6 days from Ocelum, the westernmost town in the Alpine district of Italy, into the territory of the Vocotini in the province, and then continued through the country of the Alabrones into that of the Segusiavi, the first people who lived on the bank of the Rhone, who lived beyond the provincial frontier. By this time, the Helvetii had marched through the pass and across the country of the Sequani, and had reached that of the Aedui, whose land they were pillaging. Unable to protect themselves or their property, the Aedui sent to ask Caesar for help, pleading that they had always been loyal to Rome, and that it was not right to allow their land to be ravaged almost under the eyes of his army, their children carried off into slavery, and their towns taken by storm. At the same time, the Ambari, who had ties of friendship and kindred to the Aedui, informed Caesar that their fields too had been pillaged, and that it was almost more than they could do to repel the Helveti's assaults upon their towns. The Alabrones also, who had villages and estates beyond the Rhone, came fleeing for refuge and said that they had been robbed of everything but the bare soil of their country. These complaints convinced Caesar that he must act immediately. If he delayed, his allies would have all their property destroyed and the Helvetii get clear to the country of the Santoni. There is a river called the Saone, which flows through the territories of the Aedui and the Sequani into the Rhone with an extremely sluggish current, so that the eye cannot tell in which direction it is going. The Helvetii were crossing this river on rafts and small boats tied together. On learning from his patrols that they had got 3/4 of their forces across, but that the remaining quarter was still on the east bank, Caesar left camp with 3 legions some time after midnight and came into contact with the division that had not yet crossed. Attacking them unexpectedly when they were hampered by baggage, he destroyed a large number, and the rest took to flight and hid in the neighbouring woods. The troops in this division formed one of the 4 clans into which the Helvetian people was divided, known as the Tigerini. 50 years earlier, the men of this clan had left home independently of the others, and after the battle in which the consul Cassius was killed, had sent his army under the yoke. Thus, whether by accident or by divine providence, the section of the Helvetii that had inflicted a signal defeat upon Rome was the first to suffer for it. In thus punishing the Tigerini, Caesar avenged a private injury as well as that done to his country, for a general named Lucius Piso, grandfather of the Lucius Piso, who was Caesar's father-in-law, had been killed in the same battle as Cassius. I said last time, didn't I? There's so many Pisos. Endless Pisos.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.